Good evening, everybody. My name is Arthur Holland Michel, and I am a senior fellow here at the Carnegie Council. I am delighted to have you all here with us today to discuss a topic which I believe has not received the attention that it deserves, and which it is certainly likely to increasingly merit in the years ahead. I am referring, of course, to the automated fusing of surveillance data. And if you are not quite clear as to what I mean by that, that's quite okay. That is exactly why we are here today. I am very excited to be joined for this discussion by Eleni Manes, the research director of the Surveillance Technology Oversight Project, and Chris Gilliard, Just Tech Fellow at the Social Science Research Council, both of whom have had a tremendous impact on how we think and talk about surveillance. Now, rather than list all of their many accomplishments, let me just say that their actions on this very topic are one of the very rare things that actually get me out of bed in the morning and keep me hopeful. So with that, just to say hi, Eleni, hi, Chris. It's great to have you both here.
Hi, thanks for having me.
So glad to be here.
So before we delve into the discussion itself, I wanted to share something that the Council is very, very proud to be unveiling today. So a little backstory. Last year, we brought together a crew of leading experts in surveillance issues to think about the issue of fusion. And this is the outcome of that work. It should be popping up on the screen now. Yeah, there we go. So essentially, this is a educational tool that is designed to bring the public up to speed on what is actually meant by the term data fusion of surveillance data, how it works, and what its implications are. And what I think this tool does very well is connect the activities that all of us may engage in on a regular basis, activities like owning a car or using public transport or participating in political actions, with risks of government intrusion, undue government intrusion, that are greatly enabled by this technology. As you can see, I'll scroll through it a little bit. It sort of takes you step by step in a very visual vocabulary what this technology does and what it means for all of us. Now, you can explore this tool yourself. It is now freely available. You can use the QR code that will be made available on your screens to use this as a sort of springboard for the ethics forward discussion that is so desperately needed on this topic. With that said, and we may refer back to the tool over the course of the discussion, I'd like to turn to Chris and Eleni. And first, to Chris, one of the issues, as I mentioned before, that we have identified at the Council through our work on this topic is that a lot of people don't really know what data fusion is. And so I was wondering if, to get us started, you could just describe what we mean by that term.
Kind of mechanisms of surveillance in our society right now. It's ranging from things like automated license plate readers to mics that purport to be gunshot detection, body cam footage from police body cameras, and also doorbell cameras that people will have on their front porch. So fusion is I think briefly kind of understood as the collection or agglomeration of all of that data sent to one place, and then often there's some sort of, a lot of times these are metropolitan police departments and things like that. It's sent to a central location, and often there's some form of machine learning tool, often proprietary, that runs on this data, sometimes in real time, in order to sometimes predict or often make assumptions about criminal activity. There's some discrepancy on the count of how many of these things there are. I mean, I've seen anything from 135 to 250 across the country, but it's vastly growing as we speak.
Now, I should just say that I'm sure the audience will have many questions about the sorts of things that we will be discussing today. I encourage you at any time to put those questions in the chat function that you have in front of you, and then in about 25 minutes or so, we will turn to those questions and try our best to get to all of them. Now, Eleni, Chris gave us a rundown of all of the other individual surveillance technologies that populate our daily lives. I was wondering if you could give us a sense of, why the fusion of these technologies, or the data that these technologies generate, is different, and particularly why the automated fusion of this data through, as Chris mentioned, algorithms, machine learning, is a step away or beyond what we already are very familiar with.
Okay. Well, let's start with a baseline for bad and talk about individual surveillance tools, because a single one's enough to do serious damage. A reverse keyword search can reveal everyone who searched for abortion in a state that criminalizes that care. Or body cameras, right? They present a police view of events when the footage is available at all. Individual surveillance tools are pretty terrible. What happens when we fuse their data? What's worse? I think what Chris has already suggested is that over-policing is intensified. Let me consider how that happens. And I think one thing we need to pay attention to is how multiple data points that seem to point in the same direction can seem to add up to good evidence. And it's not true, right? So piling bad data on top of more bad data does not produce good evidence. The best example I can think of is actually not automated, but I'll get there. So I was thinking about gang databases. In cities like New York, the following can add up to being registered as a gang member: wearing the wrong clothes, living in the wrong neighborhood, being friends with people in your neighborhood, being associated with them on social media, hanging out with people in your neighborhood, or even just being fingered by a so-called reliable source, whatever that means. That's all bad data, right? Sometimes a baseball cap is just a cap. Hanging out with kids on a stoop is just hanging out with your neighbors. But when police fuse data, the teenager in a hat in a certain neighborhood on a stoop with their friends, sometimes that can all seem to add up to evidence of gang membership, and it's just not true. And all of this is worse when the data is being fused automatically. I mean, part of that is automation bias. We're inclined to trust decisions that are spat out supposedly objectively by a computer. But even minus automation bias, think about it. Who wants to be the officer who sticks out their neck and says, hey, this predictive policing tool is just sending us back where we've always gone? So even minus automation bias, once we automate tools, it becomes difficult to press up against their decisions. So you may well have, here's a case of an automated fusion. You may well have a predictive policing tool that takes previous arrests, shot spotter alerts, known gang locations, whatever that means, and suggests that police continue to police the areas they've always policed. Right? Those look like many independent data points, but they all represent the same thing, right? Which is a historic pattern of policing the same neighborhoods. It doesn't add up to good evidence. So I would say that's one of the the key differences when we talk about data fusion?
I'd imagine that some people in the audience will be thinking that the types of correlations that we're talking about are the kind of things that detectives and police have been doing for a very long time. You have the classic instance in the movie of a detective who has a kind of pinboard with all of the pieces of evidence and scraps of paper and the pictures of people who may or may not be involved and strings attaching them together, and that is in one form or another a form of fusion. At the end of the day, detective work is putting one and one or two and two together to come up with some kind of conclusion that's more than the sum of its parts. And so I wanted to drill down with both of you as to what is different when you automate that process, or even to take a step back from that, what is different when you sort of fully digitize that process? I don't know, maybe if Chris, you wanted to jump in and then we can turn back to Elaine.
Yeah. I mean, for me, I think that one of the biggest things or ways to think about it is that it turns even the most minute aspects of everyone's life into data, and all of that data becomes police data. And so, Elaine mentioned abortion. I think a lot of this can be understood through the lens of the Dobbs decision, right? And we've seen states such as California try to put limits on how much what they call sensitive data is collected or transferred out of state. But it turns out that with the right kinds of inferences, or the wrong kind, the kinds of inferences that tech companies do all the time, all data becomes sensitive data. That something that is seemingly innocuous, like what you buy when you go to a drugstore, or how you've changed your diet in the past 4 weeks, or again, I could go on. But all of that becomes sensitive when you're running processes on it in order to glean some kind of information or make some kind of inference. And so the idea that all data, right, that not only what we do out and what is understood as public, our movements and things like that, but what we search and who we talk to, and and the idea that all of that becomes police data and then sort of fodder for running operations on, I think to me is particularly scary. But I think that's the most sort of onerous part that often is not maybe understood. Like to again, to briefly say it, if all data is police data, I think that's a short step to a very authoritarian society.
I just want to flag very briefly something that you mentioned that I think is important to note, being that fusion is not a practice that is unique to the law enforcement domain. And in fact, a lot of these processes and logics of correlation have actually been thoroughly tested and proven in, for example, the online marketing domain, in figuring out how to serve people ads. And it's actually a good way for our purposes in trying to, inspire dialogue and understanding around this topic, to look at some of those examples because they can resonate. So one that I'll just very quickly give is, I heard from someone who said that, certain companies, if they get one data point that it is a Sunday, and another data point that a person has not moved, as in their phone has not moved in some period of time, the fusion of those two data points will suggest that they may be lying on their couch, perhaps with a headache, and that it would be a good opportunity to serve them with an ad for some, home food delivery. So I just put that out there, to give an example of how we're all already dealing with a lot of this, but also as a way to sort of comprehend that 2 + 2 equaling more than the sum of its parts. But with that brief digression, I just wanted to turn back to Eleni as to what these unique risks constitute beyond any that, of course, we've already mentioned.
Yeah. So let me speak to Chris's point, which is that all data is sensitive data, all data is police data, and to your point, which is that there are commercial entities that are making data fusion worse. So utilities these days install smart meters. They're intended to help customers reduce their usage, right, save money, and it helps the utility avoid a blackout or too much demand during peak times. Sounds good when it works, right? Sounds pretty benign. But in late 2021, we learned that ICE was weaponizing utility data. They got it from Thomson Reuters Clear, right, a commercial surveillance product that incorporated people's payments to their utilities, gas, electric, cable. And ICE was able to figure out who, based on these profiles of individuals, who was home when, how many people were in the household, and use that data to apprehend people. This even happened in sanctuary jurisdictions like California, where local police aren't in a position or don't want to help aid the deportation of their residents. So absolutely to both of what you said. You had also talked about a pin board, right? The detective making a pin board. When we imagine who is worth making a pin board for, right? It's got to be a pretty serious crime to have a detective on you setting up a pin board. But who's worth pushing a button and telling an automated system, tell me all about this person? Maybe just somebody that you stopped on a corner. One of the concerns that I have about data fusion is that it can be used to profile people who are under no individual suspicion of a crime at all, right? Automated system, tell me who is likely to have sought an abortion in my state. Do this based on information about who drove across state lines, parked across the street from a clinic and a garage, and meet certain demographic criteria. So the efficiency with which automated tools can be used poses a risk that a detective with a pin board never did.
Your point of accessibility, I think is a very important one. For the purposes of anyone who was in New York City, who has now survived this morning's snowstorm, it's worth noting perhaps that the NYPD has one of the most sophisticated fusion programs in the world. It's called the Domain Awareness System, and it is available on every single police officer's iPhone. And it's quite eye-opening when you think about what that potentially does to the threshold for investigation and for considering a person a suspect. In the tool, we sort of identified 3 categories of risks that can emerge from the use of these systems. One being that people will be suspected of crimes that they had absolutely nothing to do with. This notion that sometimes correlations can make something seem to be what it is not. The second category of risk being that the systems can, in fact, be very, very effective at finding people who have indeed engaged in a certain activity. And that is problematic when governments criminalize activities that are actually just fundamental rights, or the exercise of fundamental rights. And then the third one being that often these tools are acquired for seemingly, well, purposes that maybe a majority of the population will be able to very much get behind, like, pursuing very violent offenders, or an example that's often given is finding children who have been abducted, but then because of the accessibility of these tools, they end up being used for targeting the unhoused population, or people who are jaywalking, or people who are putting out their trash on the Now, those are three sort of very, very clear risks that I would encourage everyone to explore through the tool. But I wanted to go over to you, Chris, and ask about what some of the corollary risks might be. If there are ways that the existence of a fusion tool within an organization creates kind of unseen risks and changes perhaps the logic of, I don't know, how data is treated or collected, or why it's collected.
Yeah, absolutely. I think, Eleni mentioned automation bias. And I think even without fusion, I think about, I'm based in Detroit. And so Detroit is, among other things, the home of three of the most high profile instances of people being arrested because of faulty facial, or because in part of some faulty facial recognition identification. And one of the most noteworthy parts of this is police came to a guy's house, arrested him in front of his family and his children, took him in. He was accused of stealing some expensive watches. And at one point, the guy, they showed him the picture that they said was him. He said it wasn't him. It wasn't him. And the law enforcement officer said, made a mistake and said, "Oh, so I suppose the computer is wrong," like indicating that, that because facial recognition said it was him, that, it was their belief that it must be him, And I think part of what comes to mind when I think about this is that that's with like sort of, one data point, right? One piece of information, and I think about the extent to which the kinds of, overwhelming, what would seem to be evidence that could be marshaled against people with systems like this. And I say could be as if it's hypothetical, but we've already seen lots of examples, right? In New York, we've seen the surveillance of Muslims post 9/11. We've seen people, riding their bikes be accused of, robbery based on geofence warrants and things like that. And so I think it's important to point out, like, this is not hypothetical. We already have plenty of examples. And a lot of those examples, yeah, are based on one or two streams of data, right? The potential swarm of information, as we call it in the tool, that could contribute to these things, I think is something worth paying attention to.
Is there a risk that the existence of this tool creates a kind of feedback loop where, if you have the capability to fuse disparate data points across different data modalities, so video with location with textual records, that will create a logic within an organization that one should always be collecting more information because it could be useful within the context of these other modalities. Is it likely, have we seen it, that organizations that have a tool of this nature will, as a result, expand their data collection practices? I don't know if Eleni or Chris, either of you wanted to jump in on that possibility.
Yeah, go ahead, Eleni.
I was going to say, I remember Fusion Center Director. Fusion centers are places where local, state, and federal law enforcement collaborate and share data. I remember one director saying, when we have money, we go knocking on doors and say, "Hey, can I buy this data set?" Because you never know. You never know what might be useful. So I think there's a certain greediness for data.
Yeah, I think this might seem like an inept comparison, but I think in many ways law enforcement can be very much compared to companies like Facebook and Google, in that there's a fairly voracious appetite for data, right? And the idea, is that more data will equal more results. Um, you know, uh, Again, I personally don't think that's borne out. But another thing that we talk about, or that is discussed in the tool, is the idea. I don't think a lot of people have reckoned with the idea of what perfect law enforcement would look like. I actually don't think that that would be a very it it would make for a very difficult society to operate in. Um, yeah.
Chris, I want to circle back to something else that you said, and I hope it's not out of place now. But you talked about false positives and facial recognition and how they pose a problem for the few unlucky individuals who are pulled in by police because of a false positive. But it occurs to me that we all lose when everyone is a permanent suspect. When it's all of our data that's being searched over and over and over again, and all more so for over-policed communities where individuals are more likely to be in facial recognition galleries or other police databases, more likely to be searched over and over and over again in case they were possibly involved in a crime.
Yeah, I mean, you talked, about gang databases. One of the things that you omitted, I mean, I'm sure but I wanted to make sure everyone else knows, is that they're often children in these
Yeah.
things, right? As young as I think 4 or 5. Um, I think that I mean, I often joke, right? There's not a lot of levity in this discussion, but I often joke that if there were, algorithms or predictive policing or fusion centers for wage theft or white collar crime, that I might talk about this differently, right? I might think about it differently, but yeah, often these resources are marshaled against already kind of over policed and the most vulnerable populations. And given kind of the movement of society at this point, I think about, we mentioned abortion. I think about trans people, trans folks, who again are often just seeking medical care, right, or seeking to go about their business kind of unmolested. And there are many states and many politicians and many law enforcement officials who are trying to make that an impossibility. And these tools are the kinds of things that would ramp up those techniques.
It also makes me think about how it seems like these technologies can vastly expand the web of suspicion. If you're in one of these powerful tools, then the tool will be always in some way actively seeking to associate you with a potential crime, because that is the purpose of these tools. I was very shocked to find out when I, as part of the reporting for a story that I worked on a few years ago for Wired, got my hands on one of these tools, an NYPD mobile phone fusion system, that anybody who had made a 311 call or who was named in a 311 call, and for our non-NYC audience, a 311 call is when you call up about, I don't know, like what would be an example? Like, if there's some leaves on the street that haven't been cleared, or if there's ice, or if there's any kind of like city living administrative stuff that does not in any way rise to the level of criminal consideration, you call 311, and all of that was recorded in the fusion system, again because it may it may implicate you in some way in a correlation that could be useful for their purposes. So I just wanted to flag that was something that stuck with me. But a big question that also keeps coming to me over the course of this conversation is, where this is all going. What do we expect to happen from here onwards in the, and I'm not even going to talk about long-term future because that's a big black hole, but even in the near term. And I'd love both of you to offer some thoughts on this, and if there are any recent developments perhaps that maybe give a sense of where things may be going. We could start with Eleni and then jump over to Chris.
Sure. I'll share a tiny bit of good news. So I was very pleased to see last month Amazon cut off police access to Ring doorbell footage. When police have access to footage from people's neighborhoods, in neighborhoods from people's homes, it just extends the long arm of police, right? It's a kind of fusion that we don't want to see. Police having access to people living their daily lives. But overall, my colleagues and I are concerned. In the past year and a half, bans on abortion and gender-affirming care have skyrocketed. That means that Fuse data can be searched to identify people who are seeking criminalized healthcare or helping their kids get criminalized healthcare. Who Googled abortion clinic, and like I said earlier, plus crossed state lines, plus parked across the street from a certain clinic. You can put that data together and profile people who are seeking healthcare or helping their kids get healthcare, or who are healthcare providers. And I worry about Fuse data being weaponized. I think it's very important that we start siloing data, right? So that, for example, California's license plate data doesn't make its way across state lines.
Chris?
Yeah, I think we've seen, I think there's a bit of a tug of war right now. There are some states, that have some real notable privacy legislation, California, Illinois. I think there are lots of groups and individuals in communities who have really strongly asserted that it should be up to them to dictate kind of what constitutes safety in their neighborhoods or in their communities. But I think federally, aside from a few isolated legislators, we've not seen any movement, I think, that in any way is going to curtail or put limits on these systems. And so that's there's a bit of good news and a bit of bad news. I'm not particularly optimistic at this point because I don't think other than a few outstanding legislators, I don't think there's the necessary will on the part of the federal government to do anything to slow this down.
I should also note that something that hasn't come up is that these tools do seem to operate in something of a legal blind spot, if you will. That there aren't specific rules for fusion technologies, right?
Yeah, absolutely. And again, I think the distinction kind of between what constitutes public and private, I think it makes things difficult. Often, and Eleni mentioned this, right, or alluded to this. Often the things that law enforcement might not be able to do on their own, they can easily go buy, in terms of data that they want on a segment of people or individuals. And I may catch a little bit of heat for this. I mean, I think the Amazon thing, Eleni, that you mentioned is important, but the sort of opposite side of that coin is that because of the way that doorbell cameras have now become almost ubiquitous, and because of fusion, now these companies don't need to go to Amazon, or the police don't need to go to Amazon or Google to get the information. They can just have the doorbell footage sent directly to them. Now, yeah, again, this needs the consent typically of the person with the camera. But a lot of people have very much absorbed the narrative that surveillance equals safety, and so Often that's not a trick to get people to consent.
Though not indeed the consent of the people who may find themselves on that person's porch.
Precisely, yeah.
This might be a good moment to jump over to some of our questions. What I'm going to do is just read a handful of them out, and then our esteemed panelists can address multiple at a time. The first question was about the data point that Chris gave early on about there being 135 of something right now and growing around the country. And so just to be clear, what that I can address that just very efficiently. That's about the number of fusion tools that seem to be in use by police departments, right?
Correct. Yeah.
Yeah. Another question is a question that often comes up, and rightly so, in events of this nature, which is about whether there are any tools or best practices that can help limit the data footprint that we all leave behind in modern life. Another question is about the international side of this, whether this is something that is uniquely happening in the United States or is most advanced in the United States, or whether these practices are very widespread. And then I'll just throw a couple more at you, and again, invite the audience to keep asking questions. Is it possible, an audience member asks, that we will reach a tipping point in terms of people's tolerance? Does it feel like we could reach a point where people will really start pushing back as a result of the sorts of practices that we're seeing here today? And then finally, and we'll wrap up the questions here for this round. Is from an audience member who asks how law enforcement can keep the public safe from the threats. Okay, here we go. The question is premised on this notion that many criminals will purposefully go to other states after committing crimes, and whether there are any alternative suggestions for capturing multi-state felons or other dangerous persons who are willfully evading these practices and perhaps siloing in that way. I know that's a lot. I'll just hand over to Eleni first, and then we'll go to Chris. Go ahead, Eleni.
I'll take the very first question because it makes me angry. So are there tools or practices that we can use to protect ourselves? Absolutely. If you search for cybersecurity training and you look for the group, perhaps an overpoliced group that you're a part of, you're a protester, you're a member of a religious community, you're seeking criminalized healthcare, you can find excellent resources online. But you should not have to, right? The only solutions to our privacy problems are at the policy level, right? We need ideally federal action on privacy. So yes, you can do something, not everything, to protect yourself, but it's wrong to ask individuals to change an ecosystem that is so much oriented towards surveillance.
Thank you. Chris?
Yeah, I think there is a widespread movement to use these tools, and I think we often, I think in a very detrimental or discriminatory way, talk about, people talk about the Chinese social credit system and things like that, right? In ways I think that are unfortunate. And part of the reason I draw attention to that is that in many ways, like the sort of economy of how we deal with data and surveillance is very comparable. It's just that it comes from disparate sources, right? And so, there's just a story out recently about the UK and them putting sort of real-time facial recognition in the subways. I mean, all over the world, I think there are examples of this. I do, I've said a lot of things that are gloom and doom, but I also do think that there are tons of communities, activists who are pushing back on these tools. I want to touch on the last question. I do think that I think it's important to not dismiss the potential for danger and harm, that that exists in our society. But I think that, I'm trying to answer this in a delicate fashion, right? Um, but in a society that is supposed to prioritize freedom of movement, freedom of association, that is supposed to prioritize civil rights, it's and again, like this is mentioned in the tool, right? I keep referencing that. It's important to strike some balance, because there is no such thing as perfect safety. I think if you live in a free society, that is a thing that we mostly understand. But the promise, I mean, the false promise of a lot of these tools is that they will deliver perfect safety if we have perfect surveillance. I don't think that's the case. And often, you mentioned this, Arthur, the level of creep with a lot of these tools is immense. And so the idea that we would use these tools to stop terrorism and to eliminate child sexual abuse material and to contain, or to arrest people who abduct children and things like that. Almost no one would disagree with those uses. But when we're, using it for all these other purposes, along with widespread narratives about the rise in violent crime, often not true, often promoted by companies who have something to gain by exhibiting that false narrative. I think it's important to push back and to think about that balance that we need to have if we want to live in a free society.
Yeah. Just to add to Chris's point, many surveillance tools simply don't work, right? So Chicago just canceled its ShotSpotter contract, or will it expire. It spent tens of millions of dollars on a system that wastes officers' time, that mistakes cars backfiring and fireworks for gunshots, that brings armed police into neighborhoods, and sometimes results in tragedy. So we can deprive police of expensive surveillance and data fusion tools without depriving them of of good tools that can actually help promote public safety.
I wanted to go quickly to your responses to the question about pursuing violent criminals, and just ask or perhaps layer onto that whether it's important that it doesn't sound like, and I'm certain you're not advocating for states to not pursue violent criminals, but what you're advocating for is that one shouldn't engage in these activities in the total absence of any guidelines and restrictions and criteria. In the same way that we all agree that people who engage in illegal activities, violent illegal activities, should be tried for their activities, for their actions, but that there are very strict rules about how a person is given due process. Is that a fair characterization of your stance on a consideration like that?
May I?
See your hand.
So public safety is not catching violent criminals. It's funding public schools. ensuring people have jobs, ensuring they have public transportation to get to those jobs, ensuring that we don't have food deserts, taking care of health risks in underserved neighborhoods. Public safety does not mean does not mean funding and overfunding police. So I guess I would reject the framing.
Chris, did you want to jump in?
Yeah, I mean, again, I would mirror what Eleni says. But I mentioned this before. I come from the Detroit area, and I have seen many of the effects of some of these policies. Of the underinvestment or abandoning of a lot of the programs that Eleni talks about. I've seen the effects of kind of runaway surveillance of rampant over policing. I have been victimized by it myself. And so, I do reject the binary, right? That we can either have these tools to the degree that we've talked about them and that are covered in the tool, or we can have sort of a Mad Max society. I don't think that's the case. And again, I mean, to go to a sort of point I made earlier, these tools are often marshaled against the most vulnerable. They're often used in ways that are not part of the promotional materials that are discussed when they are pitched, right? And finally, if in a lot of cases, if they made society as safe as the claim is, then, for instance, the UK, which has, more surveillance and CCTV than almost anywhere, would be one of the safest places on the planet, right? I mean, New York would be, if they worked in that way, then we wouldn't constantly need more. But the evidence that a lot of these tools work in the ways that we are told, I think, is often scant, right? Whether that's body cams or automatic license plate readers or doorbell cameras.
I have a question here that dovetails nicely with this discussion, which is whether the goal or solution to what we've been talking about at a policy level is abolition of these tools. Our esteemed audience member asked, does this Pandora go back into its box after police or federal agencies have had their hands on it? And if I might add to that, whether they're, the so what of these risks, if part of that is this notion that there is an absence of rules. And I just wanted to get a sense of whether there is a feeling among my panelists as to if there are policy instruments, perhaps short of abolition, that would address some of these concerns or not. With that said, I do want to bring in a couple of additional questions, or just one that has come in so far, beyond the ones we've spoken about, which is similar to how there is no such thing as perfect safety. Is there such a thing as a perfect technology where its purpose is to solely serve the ethical needs of society? Or does technology inherently involve violations of privacy? That's a lot to hand to you, but maybe Eleni, I can start with you as to go to these two questions as we enter the home stretch of our event tonight.
Yeah, I'm not sure if I can answer this question in theory, but what I'd say is that, and I want to acknowledge Greg's point that, public safety does include law enforcement, sure. But law enforcement as we know it in the United States has a history of racist, biased policing and of over-targeting certain communities, specifically low-income communities, BIPOC communities, LGBTQ people, Muslim Americans, protesters. Given this history, tools that operate on historic police data perpetuate the over-policing these communities. And it doesn't help that much surveillance technology or surveillance is conducted in secret. We talked briefly about fusion centers where local, state, and federal agencies, law enforcement agencies, share data. Set up ostensibly to counter terrorism after 9/11, at the same time that DHS was set up. They were found not to do very much, if anything, to help counterterrorism efforts, but they did violate civil rights. They spied on protesters, they spied on Muslim Americans, they helped local police forces patrol for minor crimes, leading to many arrests of people on offenses as small as riding a bicycle in an unpermitted way. So surveillance tools used in secret by law enforcement agencies known to be biased is not a recipe for a tool that respects civil rights.
Chris, before I hand to you, I'm going to chew in one additional question, and that is how data poisoning or obfuscation might affect these surveillance tools, and specifically both deliberate and accidental poisoning or obfuscation of data. So if you want to fold that into your comments.
Yeah, so I mean, I've long been an advocate of banning facial recognition, not only because of the way that it, the possibility of it falsely incriminating people, but I think that at its root, it erodes a foundation of how our society is supposed to operate. Right, the foundation of society is such that, right, is supposed to be that if you are not doing anything wrong, right, and I know that's a loaded term, but if you're not doing anything wrong, right, and you're not suspected of doing anything wrong, then you are allowed to freely move about society unbothered, right? Like that's how it's supposed to work. Facial recognition erodes that, along with many of these other tools, but I think in some ways facial recognition uniquely so. I mean, as you point out, Arthur, I mean, in some cases, many of these tools, and we've seen this with some of the sort of proprietary facial recognition tools, are often on individual law enforcement officers, their individual devices and things like that. I don't think that is. I think that's a detriment to society. And to the other two questions, right? I do think there's sort of necessitates a balance, right? That there is not a perfect technology that's going to sort of solve all these things. That there needs to be some version of individual rights respected, policy, technological initiatives, things like that. I think that would run, but that understanding that abolition of certain things should fall within the spectrum of how we deal with these things and how we move towards a more equitable and just society. I'm not, without hearing about kind of the specific obfuscation and data poisoning tools that the person asking the question is referring to, I don't feel entirely comfortable answering that one. But again, I do, mirroring what Elenia said, I'm a little skeptical often of individual narratives about community issues or societal issues.
So I had one last question for the two of you in our last couple of minutes, and it actually touches on an audience question that just came in, which refers to the fact that there are certain laws that exist that some of the practices or all of the practices that we have spoken about today may be subject to. And I wanted to note that question because my question was, what are some specific actions that can be taken? What are things that either we can do or that can be asked of those who represent us in a concrete, tangible way to address what we have spoken about today? And I would also ask that you tack on to this response something that I always ask my panelists when we talk about topics like this. And it's the following. Today has been a very long and pretty difficult day. A lot of us have been snowed on. We are now talking about, admittedly, some very difficult topics that we are going to go to sleep thinking about. And I just want you both to end by telling us one thing that you think should get us out of bed tomorrow morning, something that you think maybe is some cause for hope and optimism. So with that being said, I'll hand over to Eleni, and we'll then give the last word to Chris.
The thing to get out of bed about is that we're doing this work. Right? There are groups like the Surveillance Technology Oversight Project and other groups, the Electronic Frontier Foundation, that are working to stop police abuse of surveillance tech. So you're here, you're listening, you help amplify the message, and we're so grateful for that. I lost track of the first half of the question. I think
specific ideas, policy actions, things that either we can do or our representatives can do.
Yeah, okay. You'd asked me about my work in the New York City Mayor's office. At the time that I was there, the city created the Office of the Chief Privacy Officer, and the agency was supposed to regulate each city agency's collection, retention, and sharing of data, and disclosure of identifying information. We've talked quite a bit about commercial surveillance data and how it can replace, unfortunately, much of the need for governmental data. But I think at the very least that public agencies should do their best to limit their collection and sharing of data and to protect their residents. So, I don't want to see student incident reports being sent to police officers, much less to immigration agencies. I don't think license plate data should cross lines, given our current environment where we have states that are criminalizing abortion and gender affirming care. So I think there's quite a bit that states, municipalities can do to protect their own residents, to shield their own residents, to create sanctuaries where you can safely get healthcare or attend school as an undocumented student.
Thank you. Chris, over to you.
Yeah, I think because of our overall data environment, I think enabled by tech companies and their abuses in the last 20 years, I think that a lot of laws that would prevent some of the things that we're talking about, or at least make them more difficult because of the overall data environment, are not quite meaningful. Again, to speak to a point that we brought up a few times, that the mechanism for ranging from foreign governments to law enforcement to individual bad actors, the mechanisms for people to obtain really intimate data about people, or about individuals, groups of people, is very wide open. I think in a way that, again, is extremely detrimental, and it often allows people to circumvent laws, I think, that were meant to prevent that. But there's not been meaningful federal legislation passed in 20 years. I think it's longer than that now, but I feel safe saying 20 years. And I do what encourages me is, I think, a lot about what Eleni said, right, about individual or about organizations who are doing a lot of this work. But I've also seen a really strong response to a lot of this by young folks. Right? I think having grown up in an environment where there are radically altered expectations about what private means, what what public means, like what data is, radically altered than we experienced ideas about telling your own story, creating your own narrative, right, deciding who you want to be and things like that. I think a lot of young people have developed a mechanisms for pushing back on these things that I think sometimes can be very inspiring, right? I'm a professor, and so I've seen that, a lot of that firsthand.
I'm going to add to your excellent suggestions about what should get us out of bed tomorrow morning, a third, which is that, at least for my purposes and many others at the Carnegie and those who are working with, we have to get up tomorrow morning because we all have a meeting to continue this work on fusion surveillance and what should be done about it. And I say that not only because I need to set an alarm, but also because we are going to be continuing this work. We are going to have more outputs. And I would just want to extend an invitation to our community to get involved in this discussion, to reach out to us, to give us your input, because I think there's a fundamental belief here among us all that the more people that are talking about it, yes, these issues are very, very complex, but and the ethics are difficult, but the more people that are involved in this discussion, the better and the stronger the outcomes will be. So please do reach out. We're always open for business. My final order of business is just to thank the two of you, Eleni and Chris, for your time today and for your extremely valuable input and insight. I encourage everyone to continue to keep track of their work and their outputs, because it is truly at the heart of so many of these issues. Well, that's all from me and from the council. Thank you very much for joining us, and we'll look forward to hearing from you and to seeing you all again very, very soon.